Welcome to Absolute Nianema, the series about operators who makes me go, that's Absolute Nianema, and today is a very fun one. For me, that is. For you, maybe not. Because you have to listen for 5 minutes at the end of this episode about how I plan to fix a subclass that arguably doesn't need fixing. That's right, today we're doing Scene, because sloths are, adorable. Scene is adorable, and her niche is adorably pointless. Man, I'm coming straight out of the gate today, just like a human crack, which is just bakushin. Okay, let's just slow down, like our sloth girl here, and take it easy. Real easy, I say, and work through all these points together. There's 2 elephants in this room, so let's address the biggest one of them first. The summoner subclass and why they suck. Look, I know on paper it sounds like a cool subclass since it's a class that fulfills the classic fantasy of being a summoner by giving you mini summons to deploy, which is cool, and I like them for that. The key problem, though, is that they're tied to the deployment system, though, and because these summons are not only asking for your DP to deploy the operator, but also for each summon, and then these summons continue to add to your deployment limit, well, that's really the main problem here. Every other subclass that has a summoning gimmick at its core doesn't contribute to the deployment limit at all. Yes, they all have their own restrictions, which is usually deployment range in the case of tacticians or killing enemies in the case of shapercasters, but because summoners are asking for your deployment slots, their summons are now expected to compete with actual fucking operators. This is why the stupid drunkard that is Ling has been the only successful summoner, because her SV was stronger than most operators once you get the big dragon down, and in recent years, it has been ugly and rightfully pushed aside by Evelana's S3. And of course, I know you're gonna say, but what about Radiant? Well, yeah, but I'm not really counting IS as a part of our use cases here just yet, alright? Now, if a limited 6-star summoner can be relegated that easily, what do you think would happen to any 5-star or below summoner? Yeah, they basically become niche-only operators. Of course, summoners aren't that bad, but the main 2 uses are in low op challenge clears, or as a sort of plan C where everyone else is dead, and you gotta like throw a bunch of summons while you wait for redeployment times. But let's be real, you're only really using them for the first reason. Even in that situation, our girl Scene isn't fitting that, and that's because she's built to serve a very specific role, anti-invisibility. Scene, unlike most of her summoner companions, actually feels like a supporter, which is not a good thing in this case. Summoners might be in the supporter branch, but most of them feel more like niche DPSs than actual supporters, because once again, if you're making use of the deployment slots, you're going to need to compete against actual operators, so they end up being DPSs most of the time, because they need to have valuable damage to be worth deploying, or at least a really good form of CC. Scene doesn't do either of those, unfortunately. What Scene does is actual supporter work, and she suffers for making the right choice for her subclass. Not only that, but her niche is incredibly niche, because camera enemies is a non-factor most of the time, and when it comes up, there's better choices, and there's no better way to illustrate my point than looking at her talent. Camera Squad is all about her summons buggy cams, and they are called that because they're little robot cameras on buggies, not because they look like an Emperor of the Sea or a stupidly gimmicky fun blue deck. Sorry, my OPGCG love is showing again. So going back to this talent, we'll basically get a summon limit of 5 buggy cams, but also these cameras will reveal any invisible enemies in the surrounding 8 tiles, which is, I want to say basically nothing, but I guess there's something. But unlike Artificer devices, there's no hidden passives here. This is what you get, and it kind of fucking sucks. Yes, it's arguably better than Tsukunogi, but everything is better than my dear Miko, so that point is mute, and there is still better options. For example, Inetsu boasts better stats, generates CPs, and has a dying, and is a pursuit of fast deploy, with a talent that even lets her cover, like, those font tiles when she's not deployed. Don't like those talents? Well, Sentinels have their mod X, which basically fills the same role while putting it on a block-free tanky body, and Underflow, a member of the subclass, is a welfare. Yes, they require a mod 1 investment, unlike Scene, and Scene can deploy the clowns across the field with ease, but Underflow is arguably providing more value, and I can't think of a single situation where I would want more than one buggy cam outside of a CC specifically designed for that purpose. Yes, her mod X lets her deploy that one needed buggy cam for no cost to your deployment limit. And yes, mod fee is giving you an 8% movement slow to enemies in that little shitbox of reveal area. And yes, it gets better once we talk about her good skill, but once again, her overall value is being by underflow, especially when she becomes a record restoration later this year, and it's even worse if you already have Ines already. It's fine though, I am still a scene fan because photography, while not exactly cinema, is an essential part of the stop motion animation process, which is cinema, and when it comes to core cinema night members, I will cope as hard as I need to. And also, I'm a big fan of photography. I like to do amateur photography for myself, and no, you cannot see those photos. Moving on to skills, our first skill we are analyzing is protective camouflage, which is, yeah, that's pretty protective. Basically, after a small wind up, well, not a small wind up, a wind up, your buggies will gain camouflage as advertised and a small attack boost. And no, we are not going to waste our time justifying this skill. Everyone knows it's a bad skill and kind of defeats the purpose of buggy cams. The camouflage on paper should protect them from range attacks, but even if you invest in them feed, that's a whole ass fucking minute's worth of wind up. The attack boost is only 60%, which isn't exactly meaningful, and you can't regain more buggies from the skill. Summoners, just like artificers, can only regain more their summons via a skill that allows them to gain said devices. Your your summons will not refund it, which means if you want Scene to replenish her cross-guild figureheads, she will need to retreat herself, then be redeployed, and then wait for a whole ass minute again to reactivate the buff again. Now, not every single stage will need you to go through more than 5 buggies anyway, so the skill's probably main use case is as a normal summoner daily driver skill, but why are we using CNS1 as a daily driver? Like, I don't even think the most devoted scene fanatics are that mental, because her S2 offers a better skill cycle while having better stats in more viable use cases. So once again, I must ask, what's the point of this skill? Because I ain't seeing one, and trust me, I'm trying to. God, I walked into this one. Panoramic Overload isn't an overload of text, thankfully, but it's also a good enough skill. Basically, one skill activation is giving you a clown, and then gives your deployed clowns an attack buff, a defense buff, a res buff for some reason, and most importantly, increased detection range on invisible in Invis Reveal. This is the leverage she has over the other options, because this is actually quite sizable. Sure, it's only adding an extra 3 tiles on each side of their original range, which isn't much on its own, but once you factor in that you should ideally have 2 of these out, that's pretty good coverage, and while also having that 8% slow on Mod X more worthwhile, because once again, more coverage for it to be more effective over a longer period of time. And look, and the stats you gain from the skill is fucking massive. At skill level 7 is 8% buff to the buggy's attack and defense with a plus 15 res for 17-second uptime, with 130% for those buff stats, 20% res, and 20-second uptime if you get the M3. And yes, it does stun all your buggies for 5 seconds at the end of the skill, but look, they'll still be able to do their main job of revealing even when stunned, so I say that's a fine downside. Plus, there's an argument to be made that the defensive stats it gains for the duration of the skill is better for survivability than the camo on S1, because realistically, they'll be sitting in the middle of lanes to do their job, so giving them actual stats to defend and actually deal with enemies over a gimmick is better for them. That said, I don't think this is enough to make a mainstay in any rosters outside of like scene superfans if you are even remotely a fan of summoners. I brought this up, but I will bring it up again. It's hard to justify using a summoner outside of low op clears, and even then, Scene will not find her place in there. Yes, her S2 offers her delivery agency squad a sizable buff, but they are hampered by their actual attack range, and their only other real use case outside of camo reveal is that 8% slow with mod free. But if I want that, I can just bring like an ambusher or a D-cell binder for something more consistent, and with something extra that will be more applicable. To expound on my thoughts on summoners though, since will loop back into Scene, I think tying summons to deployment limit is the biggest mistake they ever made with this, class. It has kind of funneled summoners into being one thing, which is DPSs, and taking out the possibility for actual fun supportive uses for them, and Mod X is merely a band-aid fix to this solution. There's only been one time I think summoners have been good outside of an IS environment, which is during the Virtuoso event rerun, where Summoner Mod X was bugged, because that bug made all Mod X summoners consume no deployment slots on your summons, and holy mother of god, it was actually good in a non-OP sense. I cleared that event using Mayer S2 and Magellan S1 while using my normal daily driver squad, and it was great. It felt like what summoners should be, a mix of DPS and supportive capabilities, and has made me obsessed with fixing this class. My proposal is quite simple though. We need to make the current Mod X base kit and make new Mod X allow them to have 2 summons for free instead of 1. The current Mod X helps summons feel like actual summoners, but it still feels like it's capped. But with that one extra summon, I think basically all current Mod X summoners will suddenly be way more viable in normal play. For example, Scene is suddenly way more viable and arguably the best anti-camo reveal because she gets to deploy 2 free buggies for cheaper than compared to deploying 2 Mod X Sentinels, and these 2 buggies help maximize her coverage when S2 is up, and you still can use them like a normal squad because of it. My proposed Mod X would simply help her be that little bit more viable, without making it too OP for everyone else who has in the Mod X argument. And while I think making current Mod X base kit can be problematic with a certain idiot in mind, I think we are at a point in the game where unshackling budget Vasco shot wouldn't be a problem. Anyway, I plan to discuss this proposed change every time we talk about a summoner and how it would benefit them, because I think it's really just good food for thought in terms of summoners. Out of all the subclasses in the game, summoners are arguably the one suffering the most, at least in terms of how they're being treated by the module system, and at least by the deployment system as well while we're at it. And I think any way to improve this class should be discussed, especially if we're going to insist on making even more of them in a post-Sui society, and especially in a post-Mummy society.